How's it going, everyone? Thanks for tuning into my lesson plan again. Today we're mixing it up, talking navigation systems and radar services. To do this, you're just going to need maybe model airplane and my supplemental PowerPoint that I've attached. It should be on Canvas, and it's going to take about maybe 40 minutes, plus or minus however long it takes. Kind of a rough estimate. The main thing about navigation systems is that we want to know where we are and where we're going and how to get there. And navigation systems, well, we can use piloted dead reckoning by flying from place to place and then calculating time, fuel, distance, and heading. It's always good to know exactly where you are in reference to something, whether that be a VOR, reference to a ground station, or a GPS referenced on a map. And it's also good to know how we are seen from ATC and how that all works and how both of those coordinate together to make flying safer, possible, and more efficient and faster. To jump into it, the attention is an article, an old article about the history of navigation. And it started out as just rotating lights that you would, make mail runs at night. And so you just go from light to light and follow all those that could only be used in good weather and very ineffective. But if you boil it, we'll learn how VORs work. It's kind of the same principle of just going from station to station across the country. So it's kind of funny how that's now with GPS. We are, we're changing things up a little bit, but for a lot of years there, it was very constant. So the first thing today that we're going to talk about is a VOR. A VOR is a very high frequency omnidirectional range. It's a navigation facility takes three things. It takes a ground facility, it takes airborne equipment, and it takes two things. It takes those two things, and then it takes a displaying device, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's three types basically. There's a VOR, VOR DME that has distance measuring equipment on it, and there's a VOR TAC or a VORTAC. A TAC is a TACAN, which is basically a VOR but for military use. We don't really have to worry about those because we're not military. So it's a station on the ground that where you can use to navigate to or from. And so it spits out a bunch of lines, and we see what line we're on. We're going to talk about this more, and we can just get on that line and follow it all the way to the station. So let's break down what very high frequency omnidirectional range means. Very high frequency. Very high frequency is defined as between 30 and 300 megahertz. It's typically used for broadcasting sound and television. So you notice that if you listen to the radio, who does anymore because Spotify exists, you're tuning into those radio stations, 97.3, 107.5, 103.2, The Fan. You top out at 107.95, and you can't listen to anything beyond that. And that's because beyond that is reserved for aviation navigation by the government. VOR frequencies, they have a frequency just like we're talking on the ground to ATC on 118.3, so that's a little bit above VOR. So below aviation communication and above civilian radio lives these VORs. The lower end is I think up to 112 or 113 or 114, I forget, is ILS. So between 108 and 114 is or 12, I forget the exact definition. That's an instrument piece of knowledge. Is ILSs, and that's like a VOR kind of, but it's used to get you to the runway. It's an instrument thing, and we won't talk anything about it until instrument. So it works in those bands between 108 and 117.95. Okay, so we got very high frequency. We got omnidirectional next. Omnidirection, omni means in everywhere, in all directions, and directional means in direction. So omnidirectional is every direction. And so all that means is that it spits out lines, spits out signal in every single direction. What a VOR spits out, or what a VOR sends out, is a radio signal, but what it really sends out is it's called a radial. And so it sends out 360 radials, one radial per degree. And these radials are referenced based on direction in degrees. Most of them are referenced to magnetic north. Some of them have, swayed slightly since magnetic north changes and the equipment degrades. But it's you can check your AFD to see which ones change. Sometimes it's like add 5 degrees, but don't really have to worry about that now. So like due north, we have that 360 radial, then we have that 001 radial, 002 radial. Going east, we have the 090. Perfectly south, we have that 180 radial, and perfectly west, we have that 270 radial. And again, they're broadcast 108.0 through 117.95. There's 3 basic types of VORs, and it's based on this thing called service volume. Service volume is where it can be used and how far it reaches. Just like radio, so you can't listen to a radio for you're going on a cross-country drive. You're listening to one radio station, you'll lose it after a while, just like a VOR, because it's a ground-based radio. Or even talking to ATC, you're going to get frequency changed every once in a while. There's 3 basic types. This is figure 1 in our supplemental PowerPoint. There's 3 types. So most VORs, or all VORs, they really don't come into effectiveness until about 1,000 feet AGL, and you'll get signal on a terminal VOR from 1,000 feet to 12,000 feet and a radius of 25 miles. So there's a diameter of about 50 miles because you can fly to the station and then out from the station. Low altitude goes from 1,000 to 18,000. We only go up to 18,000 feet, so that's good for us. And then radius of 40 nautical miles. And then the high altitude one, this is hard, tricky to remember. You don't necessarily have to memorize these service volumes. Know where they are in the AIM, 1-1-4, I think. And this high altitude one, very confusing. I think the best way to think of it, Sean Purcell taught me, it's a bacon wrapped corn dog. So you have the stick, the corn dog, and then the bacon wrapped. So from 1,000 feet to 14,500, you got a radius of 40 nautical miles. From 14,500 to 18,000, you got a radius of 100 nautical miles. From 18 to 45,000 feet, you got 130 nautical miles. And then from 45 to 60, you got a radius of 100 nautical miles. Close the door real quick. Perfect. And those can be identified if you have ForeFlight. The sneakiest way is if you can see it on the low chart, it is a low. If you can see it on the IFR high chart, you don't have to know anything about that, but you can see it's a high VOR, and that's just a cheater way. Otherwise, it's an AFD. How does VOR? How does a VOR VOR? They work off of line of sight, just like FM radio works off line of sight. You have to draw your car, or aviation communication works via line of sight. You have to draw a line from your airplane to that antenna. You have to draw a line from that antenna, or from your airplane to the VOR station. And like I said, there's 2 components needed. You have the ground equipment and the equipment in aircraft. Starting at that ground station, it kind of looks like a white traffic cone with a like a fence around it. And then you have the equipment in the aircraft. There's basically 3 or 4 things that you need in the aircraft. You need that computer, which interprets all of the information. You have the OBS, which is an omni-bearing selector. That's how you select what radio you want the aircraft to pay attention to. You have the course deviation indicator, which is at the needle that shows your aircraft's relation to that radio that you have selected. Then you have a to from flag, which is showing you if that radio goes to the station or from the station. And then finally you have a flag. It's called the nav flag, and that shows if the nav flag pops up, it's an unreliable signal flag. And so it's pretty people like to confuse or complicate how a VOR works, but I think of it pretty simply. It breaks down into two steps, and it's the time between the two is what radio you're on, because that's what the computer has to figure out. It has to figure out which radio you're on, and that way it can provide information between your aircraft and the radio you're on. And so there's two phases. So first, it sends out a reference phase. We have a reference phase and a sweeping phase. That reference phase shoots out in all directions. I think of it like a strobe light on any sort of radio tower. It goes out in any direction. And then that sweep phase, I think of it like a lighthouse. And so it goes around and it points in every single radio at a specific time. And it's that time difference between the reference phase and the sweep phase is what radio you're on. So if we break it down really simply, say that lighthouse, that sweep phase, only goes 1 degree every second. So 1 second, 001, 2 seconds, 002, 3 seconds, 003. If it took you 90 seconds to go from the reference phase to the sweep phase, you would know that you're on the 090 radio. In practice, this doesn't happen once a second. It doesn't take 360 seconds for it to complete a circle. It does several circles a second, and so it's constantly updating. It's sweeping around like crazy, giving off reference phases and sweeping phases. And then that time difference is computed in the aircraft and then conveyed on the instrument in the airplane. So it takes us the time between the two. There's a few different types of equipment that's used to display which radio you're on. And the two main types are the classic old-fashioned steam gauge type and then an HSI. So if you want to turn to figure 3, 4, and 5, don't have 2 for some reason, because it's an unlucky number. This is that traditional CDI. This has your OBS knob. It's basically your selector for which radio you're on, or which radio you want that CDI to pay attention to. So say you're trying to intercept that 090 radio, you would spin this, and the whole outer ring shifts to whatever you select in the OBS, and that is what the CDI needle, which is that yellow needle right there that's perfectly centered, to pay attention to. So if we go over here, let me draw it out real quick. So we have say that's a VOR, and that's the 360 radio. We have the 090, the 180. Let's call this the 250, the 270, and the 290 radio. Say our airplanes sit perfectly right on that 270 radio. If we dial in the 270 radio too, that needle will be perfectly centered. So the needle will look like .270 is going to be on top, probably be a W for west, and that needle will be perfectly centered with a 2 flag, which we will talk about in a second. Say we're on the 250 radio. So that radio that we have dialed in, the 270 radio, is going to be off to our left, and so the CDI will show that that line is off to the left of the airplane. See that? So we would need to fly to the left to intercept that. It's very confusing. It makes much more sense when you're in an airplane actually doing it. So that shows you. So remember, it doesn't automatically center yourself on the radio that you're on, unless you're in a G1000. But we'll talk about that in a second. Other form, besides the CDI, is the HSI. That's horizontal situation indicator, and so that combines two components. That is your directional gyro and your OBS CDI. And not only is that directional gyro, does it replace it, but it also slaves it to the magnetic compass, so you don't have to keep resetting it. It uses this instrument called the magnetometer, registering lines of flux, so it automatically figures out which heading you're on and which way your airplane is facing. So it's really nice. You don't have to reset it every 15 minutes. And so what it does is it shows you which heading you're on. You can spin that needle. So instead of spinning the whole card, you just spin that needle to whatever radial you want picked. It also has a heading bug, so you can easily identify headings to fly, and it has glide slope information, which is an instrument thing for that ILS, which we've talked about before. We still have that nav flag, and we also have that to from flag. The HSI is a little bit easier to follow since all your information is in one place, mostly for instrument stuff where it shortens up that instrument scan, which you'll play around with under the hood for private. And on a G1000 airplane, or technically advanced airplane, it has this. It has a digital representation of the HSI. As we know from airworthiness requirements, we have we have a VOR check. This is only required for IFR flight. It's required every 30 days, and it's that V in A-Aviates. We have different types of checks that's good to be familiar with. You have VOT, VOR air, VOR ground, and dual, where you compare two. These all have different tolerances, and you find out about these in the back of the AFD. This is mostly instrument knowledge. So the next question we have to ask is, how do we VOR? How do we VOR? How do we navigate VOR? What ways? So the first step is to tune and identify a VOR. So just like when you have to tune a frequency into the COM1, you also have to tune a frequency into NAV1. NAV1 is where we add those VOR frequencies. So say you're navigating to the Falcon FQF. That's just south of the Denver airport. It's the VOR that I use for my private. It's 1179 5, I think. Don't quote me. Or 116 something. I don't know. Let's just say 11775. So we dial in that 11775 to the nav frequency, and we flip-flop it into the active. From there, we have to turn on the nav audio, and so we listen, because each VOR has Morse code to go with it. That Morse code is listed out on the chart supplement, not on the chart supplement, on our VFR sectional and TAC chart, in that information box with where all the information about that is located. It spells out the three-letter identifier for that VOR. So you really, unless you know Morse code, but I doubt most of us do, it's not 1860 anymore. We follow along with that Morse code and say, okay, this is the FQF VOR. In a G1000 airplane, it'll automatically decode that Morse code, and it'll put the three-letter identifier next to the nav frequency, so you don't have to listen. You still can, and it's good to get the practice, especially if you're doing your training in that G1000, and then you might go fly an airplane with not a G1000. So it's always good to know that you can just turn up the nav volume and listen to that Morse code. And also other announcements like if it's out of service, it could be on there too. There used to be this thing called HIWAS, just went out of service, I think, at the end of 2019. and they would broadcast important weather information on select VOR nav frequencies, but that's Dunzo, RIP. So we've tuned, we've identified, and so now we need to figure out where we are in relation to this VOR. So on a G1000, it's really easy. We have that course selector knob, which is basically our OBS. We just push that in, click it, and it'll center the OBS. If we're on a steam gauge airplane, we have to do this ourselves. This is where that to flag from comes into play. If we're going to the station, we want a to flag. That's if we're navigating to the station, we want a to flag. We want to navigate away from the station, we get a from flag. So say we're on that 270 radial. We want to go to the station, so we'd spin that needle. We'd spin that OBS until that needle comes perfectly centered. Once it gets there, we'll make it stop, correct it, and we want to, it should say 270 with a to flag. If we're going away, we get that away flag. And then that's when we start, the next thing we do is we turn to the heading, we turn to the way that we need to go. If we are going 270 to the station, we turn to the station. If we're going 270 away from the station, we turn to 270. If we turn 270 to the station, we're heading flying 090. That's when we start to make corrections with that CDI. So if the CDI starts to drift left, let's break. If the CDI starts to drift left, that means the course right over here, the radial, is to the left of the airplane. So we need to turn left to get it back. Once that needle centers back up, we're good. If it drifts right, we turn to the right, centers back up, we're good. The main thing that when we're tracking a VOR and it's perfectly centered, we still haven't accounted for wind, because wind is not taken into account when we're talking courses here, not headings. So if we notice that starts to slowly drift off to the left, we know we might have to put a little bit of a left crab angle in there to be able to follow. On a G1000 again, that's easy. We have that purple diamond, so we know we need to put that purple diamond on the course we want to fly. If not, then it's going to be trial and error, mostly error. That to from flag, also very important. And if any time we lose integrity, we'll get that nav flag to come down, or we'll lose that identification in a G1000 airplane. The easiest way to remember it is if you want to go to the station, find the radial you're on with the to indication and fly that. If you're going to go from the station, find the station you're on with the from flag and fly that. Because that to flag, the to from flag is very important, because if we're going on that 270, we're going to the station, and we dial in the from. We get 270 with the from. Say that needle starts to drift off left due to wind. We're going to correct for it by turning left. This is called reverse sensing, where the radial actually, the depiction in the CDI is actually the opposite of what's going on. So we correct left, and that needle's going to keep going. We're going to correct more, correct more, correct more, and boom, we're spatially disoriented. We're disoriented. So we correct and we correct and we're lost. So what we need to do is, if we're going to flag, from flag. Always good to know. The good news is if you have an HSI, something like a G1000, or they don't get reverse sensing, which is pretty cool. When you get to, say we're flying to a station, say that this is the station, we're getting to it, pretty close, within a few miles we're going to lose, the VOR doesn't project straight up, so we're going to lose the ability to, we're going to lose what's called positive course guidance. We're going to lose that navigation source. We're going to get the red warning flag, and we're going to get the to from flag might go away. We're going to keep holding that heading, and then soon enough after we cross over that, we're going to get a switch from a to flag to a from flag, which is good because we're now flying from the station. And then we're going to get that positive course guidance back a few moments after we lose it. It sometimes is a few minutes, depending on altitude and everything. So that's a basic overview of VORs. It's a ground-based navigation facility that's directional, and it works via degrees and these things called radials, which we've talked about, and your relation to those radials on a course deflection indicator, or a CDI. Some VORs are paired with what's called DME. When we're paired with DME, we can know our direction away from the station. I'm going to grab some water real quick. Stand by. DME, distance measuring equipment. It just shows our distance away from the VOR, or whatever we're navigating from, off of. And it measures it in nautical miles, but in slant range. So looking at figure 6, it measures our distance in the slant range. So from here to here, instead of measuring distance over the ground, it measures our distance over and up. So say we're at Denver, we're navigating off the Falcon VOR, which has DME. We plug in the Falcon VOR, and that DME automatically has a corresponding HF frequency because it uses high frequency, which is lower than very high frequency. I don't know why it's high, very high, and ultra high, but I don't know. You tell me. It's kind of confusing. But those high frequencies are paired with the VOR frequency, and so it'll adjust itself automatically, and then it'll display your distance from the station in slant range. So say we're cruising at 10,000 feet, and the Falcon VOR is right at about 5,000 feet, and we pass right over that VOR. It's still going to show a distance of 1 mile. And so there's a baked in little bit of error, but as long as you know it's in slant range, we can account for that. And the nice thing about DME is it knows your precise location in space, in 3D space, if you're using your altimeter too. You can know exactly where you are. Because the problem off of navigating with one VOR is that you just know your location along one straight line. You could be 10 nautical miles from the station, 20 nautical miles from the station, or 1 nautical mile from the station. You don't know. But with DME, you know exactly. You can say, oh, I'm on this radial, and I'm at this distance. DME, just like VORs, are going away due to GPS, which we will talk about in a minute. But spoiler alert, it's really easy, and it is very easy to navigate off of. That's why these things are going away. The next thing that we need to talk about is NDBs, non-directional beacons. So if we think DME and VORs are going away, these are really going away. They're almost gone to begin with, but there's a few aspects or concepts that we can learn from NDBs that we can apply to navigating via, mostly in technically advanced airplanes with these things called bearing pointers. But NDBs were like VORs before VORs. They were the main source of navigation systems back a long time ago. So we said VOR is a omnidirectional, so it spits out directions in every single direction. NDB is a non-directional beacon. So it is non-directional. All it does is it points to the station. You have a needle on your display, so instead of selecting which radial to pay attention to, and then your computer computes your relation to that radial. You don't have any control over the needle of a NDB. It just points to the station. It uses high frequency waves and uses these things called ADFs and RMIs, and it has a bearing pointer which just points to the station. My private Czech DPE was an old retired DC-10 captain. He was asking me NDBs. Do you know what NDBs are? I said, no, I've never heard of those things. What are they? He goes, they're the best way to navigate. They just point to the station, you just follow the needle. Which, if you learn an instrument, which it's not the best way. There's these just because in some airplanes you're not able to rotate that outside sleeve like you are in OBS or a HSI, which is slave to the compass. So you have to do a little bit of mental math to figure out, all right, which heading or bearing, since in navigation we're talking bearings, do I fly to get to the station? So looking at figure 8, we have a mathematic formula and a acronym to go with it. So it's MH plus RB equals MB. So that's magnetic heading plus relative bearing equals magnetic bearing. The way I remember this, shout out Elliot Lowe, Mary had roast beef equals Mary barfed. It's kind of a silly goose thing to say. Oops, nailed it, got it. So let's define each of these things. Magnetic heading, we should all know it's the heading that we're flying. Relative bearing is the difference between us and the needle that is between like magnetic north or whatever we set and the station as identified as the point of the needle. So we have to calculate the difference. So say we think about it as the nose of our airplane is 360. In this example, that looks to be about a 220 relative bearing, and we look to be going on about a 030 magnetic heading. And so applying this formula, we can Mary had magnetic heading 030 plus relative bearing 220 equals magnetic bearing, which is what do we say? 220 plus 260. That looks to be a little bit southern than due west, which makes sense. That's what we have to fly to be able to get to that station. Nowadays, it's mostly used as compass locators, which is again like an instrument thing used on approaches. And we're now using it as a substitute for GPS. But the main takeaway is those bearing pointers we use on the G1000. And it's really nice because if we can navigate off those bearing pointers by using the same principle, Mary had roast beef, Mary barfed, we can, it helps us on that practical test, right? So we have the PTS lays out that we have to get to some certain points within 2 minutes of our calculated time. And so if we can plug those points in upon reaching that station with an NDB or using a bearing pointer, as soon as we get there, that needle totally flips. There's this big movement, and so it's really easy to note. So if you can plug those waypoints into the GPS, probably, or using, maybe you can also use a nav, like a VOR, a VOR, and using those bearing pointers off of that. Once you get there, you'll get that big point. So it takes a lot of the ambiguity out of how long does it take me to get here, and how do I know when to start my timer for the next waypoint. You can just, use those bearing pointers, and those will help you out. All right, so we've covered basically the ground-based navigation. So now we're moving on to everyone's favorite magenta line, space-based navigation, GPS. So just an overview of the history of GPS. It started in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s by the military. And then there was this crash. It was either a 777 or a 747. I'm leaning towards 747 from Anchorage to somewhere in Japan. And this was obviously during the height of the Soviet Union, and they did not like people crashing into their airspace. They were flying off of VOR, and what they had done, they did something wrong with the VOR, and they had drifted off course, and they hadn't noticed they were drifting off course. And so they drifted actually into Soviet airspace, and they were shot down by the Soviets. And so this is at this point, President Reagan said, all right, we should be able to open up this space-based, super precise way of navigating to the general public. And so they started letting the airlines use it. And then eventually, it's a commercial and general aviation thing. And now basically everyone has GPS. But I don't have the Rona. So there's 3 components for GPS or space-based navigation. That's the Global Positioning System. We have the space-based components, and that's broken into 32 satellites and 8 orbital planes. So there's 32 satellites up in the sky, and they're following 8 different ways to orbit the Earth, which 8 divided by 32 is 4. 7 times 3 is 21, 23, 24. Yeah, 4. Never mind. Forget I did that math, but it adds up. We have those ground-based components, which monitor those satellites and make sure everything's going on with them. Because inside, we'll get down what's going on in the spaces. And then we have the plane-based component, and that interprets the signals from the satellites, and that's the thing that actually determines your position in 3D space. And so we talked about how does VOR, but how does GPS? GPS is by those space-based components, which are satellites. We all know what a satellite looks like. It has those solar panels and it like drifts around, you know? On there, it's GPS. If it could be described in one word, it would just be time. Just like VORs it could be described in one word as time. GPS could also be described as time. So on a GPS satellite, there's an extremely precise atomic clock. Atomic clock measures time based on the decay of a material based on the atomic level as atoms start to decay. Things have half-lives. That's, what is that called? Geology / science. And it transmits each satellite transmits the time to the receiver. And so the receiver on the airplane interprets all the times, and just by the differences in times between each of the receivers, it can determine your position. So if it is talking to 3 satellites, it can determine a lat long by using the differences and the time it takes to receive that time. It's like a time code. If you have 4 signals, you can have your lat long, but also altitude, position in 3D space. If you have 5, you have this thing called RAIM, which we'll talk about right after this, called Receiver Autonomous Integrity Monitoring. And it's an instrument thing, but we'll just give a brief overview of it because it's kind of important, and it's also for VFR. We only have to navigate VFR by GPS, but most of us are using IFR-capable GPSs. So what is this RAIM? It's called Receiver, like I talked about before, Receiver Autonomous Integrity Monitoring. And usually it's required for IFR navigation, and it's required for GPS approaches. All it does is it guarantees position accuracy. So it doesn't make your GPS any more precise, but you need 4 satellites. If you have a 5th, you can have these 4, these 4, these 4, these 4. So there's just so many more combinations that if you lose one, the 5th one can fill in the gaps, and vice versa. So what do we use as a VFR pilot? What can we use GPS for? We can use it to navigate along an airway on a cross country. We can use it for determining position at any time. We can use it for time, fuel, distance calculations on anytime we need to recalculate on a diversion, on a practical test. Just as a good pilot to keep as a reference to monitoring our fuel burn and how much we should have left. Big one is airspace awareness. Some of us fly around. Both my private and instrument and commercial training was done either in Bravo airspace or avoiding Bravo airspace. And so having your position over that Bravo airspace, knowing exactly where it starts and ends, is super important and super helpful to be able to see your position in relation to that airspace. But it also helps us avoid restricted airspace, or knows when we have we'll go into an MOA, and also stay out of TFRs. VFR waypoints. There's specific waypoints that are just for VFR traffic. In Salt Lake, there's so many because we have those VFR transition routes. And we can dial in those VFR waypoints and just VPBRN. Sometimes it's harder to see on a super hazy day and we have some bad inversion. We can't see that barn out on the barn transition. So we can dial in VPBRN and just navigate up that magenta line to help us navigate. And then a really fun thing is the direct to function. So instead of navigating on my private pilot check ride, he took a look at my flight plan. It took me, hours to plan this flight out. I had it drawn out on paper. I had my paper chart. I had different waypoints, backing it up, VORs, airspace avoidance. And he looks at it. He just looks up at me and he goes, "Why aren't we going GPS direct?" The same guy that was lecturing me about NDBs being the greatest form of navigation asked me, two sides of the stone here. He's asking me, "Why aren't we going GPS direct?" I said, "Well, I have this super meticulous route I'm using, piloted dead reckoning, different forms of radio navigation." He goes, "Let's just go GPS direct. GPS is great." So don't be afraid to dial in your destination airport, hit GPS direct, get that, and just fly straight to your destination, because quickest, most fuel efficient, and ultimately, if you're talking to ATC, you can just say, "I'm going direct to this airport," and they can go, "Okay, we can help you maintain situational awareness by giving you VFR flight following," which we'll talk about when we get to radar services. So how do you GPS when flying in the VFR environment? GPS mainly is for instrument flying because it is a form of navigation. That's not when we're in the clouds and we can't see the ground and we can't pilotage and dead reckon ourselves. We're going to be using GPS to fly, and so to GPS, but it is also an incredibly useful tool for situational awareness while flying VFR. We're going to talk about VFR concerns in a second, because there are many, especially to VFR pilots. But let's first cover how to GPS while VFR. So we can, there's a few things that we can do for peace of mind. We can check RAIM, which is always a good tool to have, just guaranteeing peace of mind, right? Check our navigation database. That's something specific to IFR-capable GPSs. These first two things are. It's something if you fly a G1000 or even a Garmin 430, 530, 630, 730. It'll come up right when you start the screen, and as long as that's within its date, you should be good. You build your flight plan, so you can put in all those different waypoints. You can put in VORs, user-defined waypoints as in Latin long, and you can put in fixes in terms of intersections. And so one thing that I like to do is if I have a VFR waypoint, like say it's a bend in the road, you can go to the nearest page and see if there's an intersection, an IFR intersection around there that you can plug in. It has a 5-letter code. You can navigate direct to that intersection, and then also you can say, "I'm going to navigate to this intersection, but I'm going to back it up with a visual point looking out the window." That way you're navigating off of two sources of navigation, not just GPS and not just pilotage. And then the main one is you just follow the magenta line. It'll spit out when you build a GPS flight plan. It'll spit out a number to fly, and that's the bearing that you fly. And in older airplanes, you can tie that to the CDI, and so it'll show you your position relative to the CDI in terms of just the same thing as CDI looking after a VOR, but it is off of a waypoint. So instead of degrees, it's again nautical miles in terms of the lateral displacement between your airplane and the line between your last waypoint and your waypoint that you're trying to navigate to. And then you just follow that, and you fly off that needle, or you fly off the HSI in terms of a G1000 or airplane with a HSI in. So there's several concerns that are involved with GPS, especially for VFR flying. Over-reliance on the GPS. If we lose GPS, how are we going to navigate? We have to know, dead reckoning, pilotage, and even VFR navigation. Complacency, where you just fly VFR with a direct to function, and you forget how to pilotage, dead reckoning, VFR navigation. If you lose GPS, what do you do? And also, if you lose your position, if you get spatially disoriented and you don't have GPS, how do you find yourself? You need a backup. And that's why it's always good when you navigate on a cross country to navigate with multiple sources of navigation, and just to back it up. And then finally, our last thing we're covering today is radar. And radar is what ATC uses to see us. So it's again mostly for IFR traffic, so they can separate IFR traffic. Because there's VFR traffic. It's see and avoid, right? So we have to see the other traffic and avoid it. For IFR traffic, it's on ATC when you're in the clouds. And so why do we need radar? Well, we need it to get into B and C airspace, right? Because we need that mode C transponder. And they're looking at their radios or their radars. We can use it to get through special use airspace where you need clearance, to get flight following, to get vectors, especially in an emergency when we need vectors to a nearest airport. They can just say fly. If they're looking at us, they can say fly heading this, and they'll take you direct to that airport. And also if we're lost, it's a one-way that they can help us out if we're lost by telling us, where we are and where we can go to get back to being not lost. And so there's two main sources of radar. It's called primary radar and secondary radar. So primary radar, they both work in the same way. So primary radar just uses sound, is all that radar is. So radar is defined as uses sound waves to determine the position, speed, and direction of objects. So what it does is it'll send out a sound wave. We can't hear these sound waves. I think they're low or maybe high. I don't know. We can't hear them though. So we send it out. It'll hit the skin of the aircraft and it'll bounce back. And the time it takes between the sending out and the coming back is your position. And after multiple of these where it can track you, it can see how fast you're going and what direction you're going. So you can see speed, direction, and position. This is called primary radar. It was developed by the military. World War II was when it first started to be used. And again, I said it's sound waves bounce off the skin of the aircraft. It's kind of like echolocation, but for a bat. Secondary radar is what we use when we use our transponders. That's our mode C capability, where ATC can not only see our position, direction, and speed, but it can also see our altitude, which is super important for separating traffic, not only two-dimensionally, but three-dimensionally. And so all that the secondary radar does is it's that fin on the bottom, and it listens for that, it's called an interrogation signal. And so when that's pinged by the fin, it broadcasts and kind of latches itself onto the return echo of that primary radar, and then it has our altitude information on it, which is super helpful. So we can see and be seen by two different things now. It used to be just be one, which is the transponder, which sends our altitude and other information using radar echoes. But now, since January 2020, we have that ADS-B requirement. And so ADS-B is like radar, except for it uses satellites. Just like GPS uses satellites, ADS-B uses satellites. So that's the airplane talking to the satellite talking to ATC, which is great because, around mountains there's less satellite radar coverage. You need to be at a higher altitude to be able to be seen. With ADS-B, it's pretty much everywhere. Finally, let's talk flight following, because this is the main reason we like to use radar. So flight following is communication with ATC along the whole route of your flight, and I think of it as an extra set of eyes. It's not it's still on you to see and avoid other traffic, but they at least point it out to you, give you directions and give you updates. They'll help you out with special use airspace, TFRs, NOTAMs, other traffic most importantly. You must be in radar contact. You're going to get a discrete squawk code, and it's just really nice to have that extra set of eyes. So that about covers it. So just to review, we have our VORs, very high frequency omnidirectional ranges, 3 different types, terminal, low, and high, with different service volumes. How they work, it's timed comparison between the reference phase and the sweep phase, and that's displayed on our OBS using that CDI, showing our relation to the selected radio. They need to be checked if we're IFR. We tune and identify, listen to that squawk code. DME shows our distance and slant. NDBs are dead, we don't really care about them, but the bearing pointers are kind of helpful. Satellite navigation is how we navigate today using GPSs, which are using super precise atomic clocks. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys later.